Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 77 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. If you are a loyal listener to the show, you are familiar with the major themes of this program. Early on, we attempted to illustrate the journey of the justice-involved individual through our fictitious caseload of mock clients. If you are newer to the show, you may want to go back and check out some of those installments. We had some fun being creative, but hopefully we also informed the audience of what that experience is like for the client. And hopefully, as the person assuming the role of the practitioner, probation, parole officer, I did a good job illustrating some of those evidence-based interventions that we wish to promote on this show. Again, we have stepped away from those installments as of late, although I'm not going to lie, I was inspired by Fergus McNeil during last week's interview when he was talking about all of his projects, and I may go back and revisit some of those clients in the future. Hey, speaking of Fergus McNeil, loyal listeners also will know that I, of course, like to share my conversations with academics and practitioners who I consider thought leaders in criminology and related topics. And to that end, we have some brilliant guests lined up for you in the coming weeks, so please look for those as they drop over the next month or so. And of course, we get really excited when we get an opportunity to speak with someone with real-world experience to share with us, specifically their journey of change and what that journey has looked like for them from their perspective. Although we truly enjoy exploring every facet and topic of those various journeys, such as our series on trauma, for example, we primarily focus on those pathways into crime, specifically by examining the risk, need, responsivity model. And of course, we highlight those pathways out of crime as exemplified in the emerging desistance approaches. And this is why I am so pleased to bring you the insights of our next guest, Brian Pierce. Brian's story, as you are all about to hear, is a great illustration of how that trajectory is not linear. We know of the criticisms at times of probation and parole officers. It's that they sometimes fall into a way of thinking which is simply too binary. The process is simply too pass-fail. We are at times so risk-averse that we don't allow for enough setbacks in the process, and any relapse is viewed as a failure. And that even gives ammunition to those wishing to attack the principles of risk, need, responsivity, or desistance, or what have you. I want to thank our next guest for sharing his story and sharing his experiences. I'm so pleased to be able to share with you my recent conversation with Brian Pierce. Please enjoy this inspiring interview, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the show, Brian. You have an amazing story to tell. I'm really not sure where to begin. So why don't we start with you just simply introducing yourself and starting at the beginning of your very fascinating journey?
Well, thank you, Joe. Well, it's kind of a long story, but I'll try to make it as short as possible. But I was born in Minnesota, northern Minnesota, in Duluth, and I was put up for adoption. And several months later, I was adopted by a couple from southern Minnesota. And my sister was also adopted. My mother and father couldn't have children. And one thing that I just recently kind of learned is that I was told about this really young. And I was, in fact, we would get up in church and sing this song about being adopted and stuff. I really do think now in retrospect that wasn't so good because I don't think I understood it and I didn't feel too good about myself. But anyways, at a really early age, I started getting I didn't fit in well, I guess. I don't know how to explain it. I was very intelligent. I had like a near photographic memory as a child. I'm a member of Mensa now, actually. But I didn't fit in real well in the small southern Minnesota town where we were. And I guess I learned early on that being a smart kid didn't really pay off. And I started getting into trouble. And by the time I was 14, I had been already in a treatment center one time, which I failed. I was voluntarily put in there by my parents after an overdose. And my mother didn't like it. She was very religious, and she didn't like some of the counselors. So she went ahead and took me out. And we didn't do anything else. The problem, my parents didn't like counseling, nothing like that. So when I was 14, I got arrested for aggravated armed robbery of a gas station in our small town. And it's a long story, but suffice to say, I ended up going to Minnesota Correctional Facility, Red Wing. I was 14 years old, and I was sent to Red Wing on a program. I can't even remember the name of it now, but it was like the first time you went there, you went into Yale Cottage, and it was a short time where they sort of evaluate you, see how you're doing, put you out on parole. So I went into that program, and I completed and got out. I think it was a couple months, and then I was on parole. But I kept violating. I think I went back 4 more times before I turned 18. At least a couple of those times were just straight technical violations. Smoking pot was was a big thing. That was really the big thing. And I think in retrospect, I was self-medicating, but that was the big thing. Or getting money to get pot, to be honest with you. It was one way or the other. It was pot. So, I went back there. Went there a total of 5 times, and anybody who knows Minnesota Correctional Facility Redmond knows all the cottages are named after Ivy League schools like Yale, Princeton, Grinnell. So I used to joke, I went to all of those by the time I was 18, and and then when I turned 18, I didn't slow down, to be honest with you. And relatively quickly, I got arrested for several things. And at that time, what they would do, I think it was kind of a strategy. Prosecutors, they'd charge you with a bunch of things. You'd plead to several of them. Minnesota had just got the guidelines. This is in the 80s now. We're talking about 1985, 86. So what they would do is they would plead you to several of these felonies, put you out on probation, but now you had a bunch of points, and the grid went up to 6. 6 was the maximum number. So, I think the first time I got arrested at 18, they charged me with a couple counts of burglary, a drug charge, and I think a forgery charge. By the time I got done pleading, I had like 4 or 5 points. So the next time that I got arrested, which wasn't that long afterwards, it was an automatic commit on the guidelines. So
right.
By the time I was 19, I was sentenced to St. Cloud for 38 months. And that's where I went, to Minnesota Correctional Facility, St. Cloud. And I got to tell you, it was when I first went there, I'll never forget. When I was in Red Wing, my parents lived about 15 miles from, I grew up in Lake City. If anybody knew where this is, it's about 15 miles from Red Wing. So while I was in there, I was able to get a lot of visits, and even off-grounds visits. They would let you do that and stuff. But St. Cloud was a ways away from my parents. And to be honest with you, I'll never forget when I was in the sheriff's car and they were driving up to it. And I thought, okay, when I saw it, it's for those people who don't know, it's an old old style prison, the Gothic style, with a granite wall, enormous granite wall. And it's dark and it's scary, frankly. So I'll never forget when I saw it, I thought, okay, I get it. You don't have to do this. I totally understand now. And you can take me home. But of course that didn't work. And so there I went. And after I got inside there, I really quickly learned, I hate to admit this, but after I got inside there, I quickly learned it wasn't so bad. I mean, after all, I had been in Red Wing several times, and for people who know Minnesota correctional facilities, Red Wing is like the end of the line for juveniles. So a lot of the kids in Red Wing go on to St. Cloud or some other prisons in Minnesota or elsewhere, because after all, that's what happens. And so I got there, and all of a sudden I realized, hey, I know a lot of people, and I got used to it relatively quickly. And at some point, I was a pretty good inmate. I paid, I didn't cause any trouble. And so I signed up to go to the higher education program, which was a college program at that time being offered in St. Cloud. They still had the Pell Grant. This is before they took away the Pell Grant from inmates. And so I got accepted. I had a GED. Because when I was 16, I got a GED. I wasn't in Red Wing at the time. I was out, but I had to go to school. Otherwise, it was truancy. And then when I turned 16, the high school did not want me to go. The principal absolutely did not want me in his school. So he said, he agreed to let me take the GED, and I got it. So thankfully, I had that. When I was in St. Cloud, I was able to take college classes through St. Cloud State University. And I took 32 credits while I was in there. And I had, I think I had a 4.0 average, at least a 4.0 several quarters. We only took a couple classes at a time. But I then got the opportunity to get a job at the outside power plant, and it was only one inmate had that job, so I took it, and I quit the higher education program. Eventually, I got paroled, and relatively shortly after I got out, I went right back to the same behavior, and I think I was out about 45 days. And I got sentenced to a year and a day for possession of a controlled substance. And it was a transine tablet that somebody had given me, and I was going to look it up. But anyways, I'll never forget the second time when I went in there. I felt completely different than the first time. The second time I really did feel, I felt like an idiot. I thought, wow, because I had gotten along well with a lot of the guards, the inmates too, but I think people thought I was a decent guy, and I did well. I went to college, and I didn't get in a lot of trouble. And so I felt like an idiot to have gone out and in less than 2 months found myself right back into the same situation. And it wasn't, I don't mean to say that the first time was fun, because it certainly wasn't, but I was like, I jailed the first time, if you know what I mean. At one point I ran a big store, and, I became, I was elected to ISAC, which was the Inmate Staff Advisory Council. So I kind of was a player the first time. The second time, I felt like an idiot. I didn't want to engage people. I was, ashamed of myself, frankly. And you couldn't go to the higher education program if you'd returned. So I wasn't able to do that. Now, then I got out, and I went back home to my parents, and where, I'd always gone, and there'd always been lots of difficulty. But nevertheless, I didn't have anywhere else to go, and that's where I went. And again, in a short period of time, it looked like I was going to be headed back. So I jumped parole. My parents owned a resort. That's where I grew up. And there happened to be a group of these people that, I don't know if you know what magazine salesmen are, or soap salesmen. They're like a group of young people that go around and sell door to door. And they happened to be at the resort and looking for somebody. And I thought, well, this is a good opportunity to go get out of here. And so I went along with them and started traveling around the country and skipped my parole. Then eventually we were in Atlanta, Georgia, and I met my wife at a bar, and this is a crazy story. I don't even know if it should be on YouTube, but I met her in a bar, and we were married 21 days later. She was adopted like me, and she had a nice family, and they had basically written her off. And we bonded. At the time, truth is, she was a crack addict, and I was a wanted felon. But nevertheless, we got married 21 days later in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, and we were still traveling around the country, and I was trying to make money selling this cleaner and doing other various scams, like credit card scams. What would happen is I don't want to get into all the details of it, but because I would go into a lot of places to sell this cleaner, I would sometimes stumble onto credit cards. And we both got arrested for credit card fraud in Georgia and ended up in the Knowles County Jail. This is 1989. And I was actually facing a lengthy sentence, life, as a habitual offender, because I'd already been in the penitentiary 2 times. I had 9 felony convictions. And so I got a public defender, and she did, and I actually got a private counsel, but he was appointed because of the conflict. She had a public defender, and everybody said, "Oh, you got you got the lawyer, you're going to be okay." And I thought it was crazy. Oh, and an interesting thing about Georgia is I was in a one-man, I had 2 pins sticking out of my hand because I'd been in a fight and I had to have my hand operated on. So I had 2 pins sticking out of it. They put me in an infirmary cell in which there was 2 other guys. This was a single man cell, and there was 3 of us in there. I slept on the floor up against the toilet. It was blazing hot. It was nothing like Minnesota to be in this place. And so my lawyer worked out a deal to get us banished, and which actually he said is probably unconstitutional, but what do you want to do? Go to prison or get banished from the state of Georgia? And we were both banished. We went home to Minnesota. And I got a job as a painter. She got a job at Pizza Hut. And I said to her, "Look, I'm tired of this." She had 2 kids when I met her. And I said to her, it's one thing to throw away my life, but I don't want to participate in throwing away these kids' lives. So if you want to come home to Minnesota with me, we're going to go home and we're going to make a go at trying to change. And if you don't want to, that's that. And she said she did. So we did. And we both got jobs, and we were working hard, and things were starting to come, straighten out a little bit. And then there was a fire, and I got hurt at work. So I ended up going to the University of Minnesota and got my bachelor's degree. And then I went to the University of Minnesota Law School. I'm shortening this up, obviously. And then while I was in law school, I wasn't really even thinking about applying for a license to practice law. I thought I wanted to be an academic, really, because I thought maybe my experience might be useful in some kind of policy position.
Right. Yeah.
That's really what I wanted to do. But I ended up getting a clerkship at the Minnesota Court of Appeals. And then I ultimately got him into the bar. And I saw the ad for a prosecutor in southern Minnesota, and I applied, and I got it. I got the job. I was offered a job as assistant county attorney in Calvert County. And really, I think at the time, and from everybody that I know of, it was completely unheard of. I don't think anybody, we were unable to find anyone who ever was in that situation. I'd already been in the penitentiary a couple times, and now I was a prosecuting attorney. And really, to be honest with you, it was the best time in my life. I felt better about myself than I ever did, because I really felt like I spent my days trying to do what was right and good for the community. But unfortunately, what happened is the county attorney who hired me, he was in some dispute with the county that started long before I ever got hired. And I ended up having to commence a whistleblower suit when I had discovered some destroyed evidence, and I had to turn it over to the state. And as a result of that, I had to file a whistleblower suit, which I was successfully won. And I started my own practice and became a public defender. And I know that everybody needs a lawyer. Believe me, I needed one for a long time in my life. But the truth is, I don't think it was good for me. I knew it. When I was working at the Court of Appeals, a judge friend of mine said, "Oh, you're going to be a great defense lawyer." And I said, "Look, I don't really want to be a defense lawyer. I'm not sure that it's good for me to spend my days around people that were like I was, And so I became a defense lawyer, and every day I spent and I was pretty good at it. I think most people will say I was pretty good at it. And I spent my whole day trying to make excuses for my clients' behaviors or cover up their behaviors, which is what I had spent years trying not to do myself, trying to get myself to, So at some point I was, this, it's a hard story to tell. To be honest with you, Joe, I haven't told this story since this happened, but at one point I was representing a client who I grew up with, and he had become a big cocaine dealer in Minnesota. And he was constantly hiring me, constantly wanting me around, and I charged quite a bit of money, but nevertheless, he'd pay it for me to be there. And there was always cocaine everywhere, and I ended up relapsing. My wife relapsed as well. And everything basically fell apart. The truth is, though, we relapsed and we got it under control ourselves in a couple months. We realized, hey, this is a problem. We got it completely under control.
Right.
But about a year later, it came, it came up, and I ended up getting, I was told I could have went to treatment and addressed the problem, but I had already quit and I didn't have a problem, and I was so ashamed of myself I didn't know what to do. And I was really almost in a state of shock. So for a couple of years, I just basically collapsed. And then again, I ended up getting arrested for, I hate to admit it, but smuggling marijuana in Nevada. And I did another 16 months in prison. This is in 2010. 2011, I got out. And then I came to Missouri, which is where my parents are retired. My mother had cancer at the time. So I came to Missouri in 2011, and I just thought, honestly, I had no idea what I was going to do. I was totally ashamed of myself, and I didn't know what to do, but I ended up eventually getting a job at a law firm. I've been there 10 years now. I don't have a license to practice law. I work as a paralegal. I write a lot of briefs and a lot of motions, things of that nature. And then on the side, I do sentencing mitigation, which I enjoy doing. It's, something I learned in law school. I took a class on alternative sentencing, and then I later on was asked to come back as a guest for several additional sessions where we taught, basically we taught sentencing mitigation. And so that's something I enjoy doing. It's not easy to get a lot of clients in this area for that. It's something that is expensive, and a lot of people down here can't afford it, but that is something I like to do. Other than that, I really wanted to use my experience, like I said, for something policy-oriented to make a difference. And then everything crashed and burned. And to be honest with you, I've been sort of ashamed. That's why I haven't even told this story to anybody, even myself, since everything crashed and burned, because I didn't want to be the poster child for why rehabilitation doesn't work. To be perfectly honest with you, that's what I didn't want to be, because honestly, I still feel like it does work. Like if you looked at did the college classes in St. Cloud help me? A lot of people would say no, they didn't. A long time ago. I totally disagree with that. You know what I mean? In fact, I've made a living for the last 10 years doing it. I think I've helped some people doing it. It makes me feel better about who I am. I'm productive. I don't think I would have had any real disruption if I could have continued to do that. But,
I appreciate you sharing this story, Brian. And if I could just add it, I think the story really speaks, among other things, to your resiliency. And again, just sort of that coming back to more and more challenges. The story is amazing. It just, I could tell that to someone and it would sound like something out of a Hollywood screenwriter's workshop. But again, I think it really speaks to your resiliency. And as you said, you ended up then, for a variety of reasons, in Missouri doing sentencing, mitigation, consultation, which sounds like you loved. And then in 2018, you received an Unsung Hero of Missouri Law Award. What was that all about? Tell us all about that.
Well, it was just an award for people who are not attorneys but contribute to the bar or assist people in the legal field. And I really liked it, to be honest with you. I know, obviously, I would prefer to get an award as an attorney. Minnesota got a Rising Star Award, but I really did appreciate this because it reminded me that I actually can still do something useful and make a difference and help people, because it's really hard to keep believing that. I'll tell you, one big thing now, I don't want to go off on a long tangent, but one big thing now is the ban the box, where they're saying, don't ask about felons. And, I've wanted to get involved with some of these movements, but I'm afraid that some people might not like my position because, I'm not even sure that helps much, because I've had really bad experiences with that, to be honest with you. I wanted to teach the LSAT. I had a very high LSAT score. In fact, that's how I got into Mensa. My LSAT score was so high, I qualified for Mensa. So I thought, well, I'll teach the LSAT. This is just a couple of years ago now. I've been working at a law firm for years. And so the first thing I said to them was, just so you know, I've got a serious felony record. Before I waste your time and mine. Oh, no, that's not a problem. The interview took 6 months, literally. It was a series of interviews. I had to teach 3 mock classes online. I had to prepare them, teach them, all this stuff. At every step of the way, I said, just so we're clear, I don't want to waste your time and mine. I've got this record. Oh, it's not a problem. It's not a problem. I went through all this, and then they did the background check, because they're not prevented from doing it. They just don't ask it on the application. So then right away they're like, no, can't do it.
Well, there's a lot of systemic changes that got to take place. You mentioned the ban the box and these other efforts to sort of get past these barriers that we put up are just so counterintuitive to the reintegration process. To that end, Brian, you've mentioned a lot of your experience from Red Wing to St. Cloud, the state of Georgia. Just broadly speaking, what do you feel works in the rehabilitation and reentry process? And conversely, what do you feel we're sort of spinning our wheels on that really does not work?
Well, I believe education definitely works. In fact, I think it's not foolproof, but the truth is education opens doors. It changes minds. It changes lives. And it does that not just for people that are trying to reenter from incarceration. I mean, it does it for anybody, face it, that's what it does. So although it's not perfect, it definitely is one of the best tools we have at making people, I think, more productive and better citizens, better neighbors, which is what the goal should be, really, of the criminal justice system, in all honesty. I mean, people are going to be released, and what we want is to release people who are better and more equipped to be contributing members of society. And one thing I will say about my experience, that I sometimes think I see a lot of people involved in issues. There are a lot of people that were wrongfully convicted. That's an issue. But I don't think criminal justice policy, I think criminologists know that career criminals, and I think a lot of people would say I probably fit that definition, at least for most of my life. Career criminals, I think, are really the problem. Most criminologists will say, 80, 90. I haven't looked for a long time since I was in college, but I know the percentage of crimes that they commit is very high. That's the problem. That's what we need to be dealing with. I mean, some people get in trouble, they never reoffend. And so we don't even need to worry about them. But the real problem is, how do you get to somebody basically like me?
There's a theory in criminology, as you noted, that 20% of the folks in the system are committing 80% of the crime. Let's focus on the 20% versus this sort of broader approach where it becomes this crazy net widening, scooping folks up into the system that really have no business being in the system. It's sort of a resource misallocation effort. So to that end, maybe you've already answered this, Brian, but what advice would you give to either a warden or a say a corrections director of a probation or parole agency that was really looking to make some serious changes in how they do business. If you had their ear for an hour, what would you tell them?
I was thinking about that, and one thing I think that's interesting is I went into Tour St. Cloud in the 90s. A guy was writing an article about me for the St. Paul Pioneer Press, Ruben Rosario, and he managed to get a tour of St. Cloud. And this is, I think it was about 98, 99. And what I think was interesting is they had made a lot of changes. If they had asked me, they had made a lot of changes that I would have said. When I was there in the 80s, of course, it changed when I was in Nevada. It was a lot different. But in the 80s, when I was there, we had our own clothing if you could afford it. We had little coins that you could use in the machine. You could send money out and back and forth real easy. A lot of things that we could do that were definitely not safe, and provided like the clothing is make some market, some money. And in the kitchen, another thing I really liked was in the dining hall, we could sit wherever we wanted. That was the most dangerous thing when I went the first time. Yeah. Well, when we would go into the dining hall, when I was there in the 80s, when you went into the dining hall, you didn't know if somebody didn't tell you this, but there was a section for Native Americans, which, by the way, at this time in the 80s was very tight, small knit section in the back, but real tight. Then there was an area that, was African American. In St. Cloud, we had a small Asian area, and then there was the white area. And you wouldn't know this when you went in there. I mean, I didn't know that. And you go, and even within that section, everybody has their own chair. They go to the same chair every time, and it's important to them, and they sit at that table, and that's a big deal. You might get seriously hurt by sitting in somebody's chair. So what I noticed is when we went back for the tour, we went to the dining hall. We actually got a chance to eat. And what they were doing now is a person would come through the doorway, and instead of them sitting wherever they want to sit, there would be a guard there who would say, boom, 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 you sit there, you sit there. And they took away all that. And I thought, this is just genius thinking right here, that if they'd asked any of us, we would have said, hey, that would solve the problem. So that was one of the things. One thing that I've always said is I personally think when we just warehouse people and we are doing a timeout, letting them sit in the cell, if we're going to put somebody in for life, that might be an effective thing to do. But otherwise, I think we could really shorten the sentences and make it more effective if we don't allow that. I mean, people should be, I think when you're there, one thing I always think is real life can be boring and mundane and all these things that somebody like me can't stand. But that's something, I'm used to it now. But when I was young, I didn't like any of that. But that's what real life is. You get up, you go to work, you pay your bills, even though you'd rather go out shopping, all of these things. And so I've always thought, why you shouldn't have the option of saying, I'm just going to lay up in my cell unless you want to give up every privilege that you have and sit down in solitary. Because my personal opinion is if we made them the time effective by making them, get up, clean, go to work, learn something every day, all the time. At some point, a person says, look, if I have to do all this, I might just as well do it out there. I mean, when I was in Nevada this last time, literally I walked around and played cards. That's, and I wasn't the only one. I mean, that was like almost all of us. That's what we did. I mean, what is the point? You got to have lengthy sentences if you're going to want to have that be meaningful, because it's not. Anyways,
we try to dispel myths and debunk what the public misperceives about the criminal justice to the degree that we can on the program. Brian, is there one thing in your opinion that the public just gets wrong about prisons and or our rehabilitation efforts?
I do think so. I think one thing that they get wrong is they think that something that looks like punishment is what they like, what they want. I mean, I remember in law school, one of my best friends did a study on boot camps, and they found that they weren't really effective. They had a very short-term effect. Nevertheless, people loved it because they love to see people being yelled at and being shaved and being made to work. Now, when I said earlier, I want the time to be effective by making them do things, what I didn't say, and I wish I would have, is not by humiliating people and making them do menial jobs just for the sake of doing them, not breaking bricks, that's not what you do. That doesn't work. I think the public likes that. And what they think is treatment is coddling people. That's what they think. But the reality is, this is what I've learned in my life, is the reality is working on yourself in any way, working on yourself emotionally, improving your education, all of these things, they're not easy. That's why not just incarcerated people and criminals, a lot of people resist doing that type of stuff because it's difficult. It's not easy. But the perception is if we put them in treatment, that's easy. It's better if we send them to sit up in the cell all day, watch TV, and play cards with his friends. That doesn't make any sense if you think about it. Forcing someone to look at themselves, forcing someone to do something about their behavior is way more difficult.
Yeah, exactly. Brian, thank you for your time and for sharing your story. I appreciate the courage that must have taken. Anything big on the horizon? You're settling into a nice chapter of your life, it sounds like, there in Missouri.
Well, I'm trying to work on a few things. I'm not exactly sure yet, but I am working on a few things. We'll see. I've thought about trying to get readmitted again,
Well, we'll keep in touch for sure, Brian, and I'll watch for those milestones as you continue to rack them up, and we'll maybe have you back on the show to share more of your journey with our listeners. It is an inspiring one for sure. Brian Pierce, we can't thank you enough for your time. We hope to talk to you sometime in the future.
Thank you.
Thanks, friend. My sincere thanks to Brian Pierce for sharing his life story with us. And as I noted in the intro to this interview, the change process for justice-involved individuals is not necessarily a neat and clean, linear event. I have had the opportunity to speak with Brian before and after this interview. One thing he communicated to me that he neglected to note during the conversation was that he believes that while he was in jail in Georgia on the floor of a one-man jail cell, he had an epiphany. He recalls being so angry and wondering why has all this shit happened to him, and why are some people's lives noodle salad, as Brian put it, while others are downright miserable. And all of a sudden, on that floor of the Georgia jail cell, he understood that life is unfair and it's just the way it is. No matter how he got to where he was, that jail cell in Georgia, he was responsible for where he was going, and nobody else was going to make his life better. It was up to him and him alone. He says, folks may think that sounds foolish, but he legit had that epiphany while incarcerated in Georgia. Now, of course, if you paid attention to the interview, you know Brian has relapsed. There have been setbacks since then, but that doesn't mean he still does not recall the epiphany he had that day in Georgia. And as a reminder, when Brian returned from Georgia with his wife and her two small children, ages 2 and 3, that's when he went to college, and he went straight through to law school, 6 straight years of university. He was also working at that time. Brian feels all of this made him a good lawyer, but along the way, he was not provided with some of those fundamental skill building tools that a lot of us got on our pro-social pathways. He feels that college and law school helped him develop as a person, but in hindsight, maybe what was missing were some of those therapeutic skill building elements that would have helped shape him as well. Again, Brian, thank you for having the courage to share that story and for illustrating to our audience that everyone's pathway out of those dark times of their life are different, and oftentimes there are setbacks on that pathway. Doesn't mean that it's not a success nonetheless. Hey, I mentioned some of the rock star guests I've got lined up for you all in the coming weeks and months. Next week, super excited to be talking with Dr. Vincent Figliomene. He is joining us from Italy. He is an American, but he is an organized crime expert. Got a lot of great responses from my interview a few weeks back with Dr. Anna Sergi. And so along that same vein, super happy to be talking with Dr. Figliomene. He is an expert in many things, which you're going to hear all about, up to and including, of course, the Italian Mafia. He is currently the director of the Francesco Figliomene Social Science Research Center, a nonprofit independent social science research activity located in Siderno Marina, Italy. Super excited to be talking to Vince. You're going to have a great time listening to that interview next week. If you have any questions for Dr. Figliomene, reach out to the show at our email of thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. You can also reach us through our website, theparagongroupllc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices, or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and our Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter. You can follow us at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn, and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is now available. Reach out if you'd like some merchandise. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
You know, I went back there. Went there a total of 5 times, and anybody who knows Minnesota Correctional Facility Redmond knows all the cottages are named after Ivy League schools like Yale, Princeton, Grinnell. So I used to joke, you know, I went to all of those by the time I was 18.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.